This is Emory. You're listening to another episode of Tech Policy Grind, a podcast from the Internet Law and Policy Foundry. And this one coming up, this episode that you're listening to right now, I think it just might be my favorite episode we've recorded thus far. An absolutely fascinating discussion with two academic powerhouses, Kendra Albert and Elizabeth Ann Watkins. Joe will introduce Kendra and Elizabeth in just a moment, but Kendra is a technology lawyer, a fellow at the Internet Law and Policy Foundry, and together with Elizabeth, they have recently published and have presented on their work on the gig economy and the digital security divide. On today's episode, we'll talk about that work, the issue of cybersecurity educational disparity in the gig economy, and what can be done about it. But we also talk about their experiences in the Ivy Leagues, how an arts education carries over to law school, and the social and cultural elements of cybersecurity awareness. As always, if you like the show, please rate and review us on iTunes, and consider reaching out to us on Twitter at Tech Policy Grind. We are always looking for feedback and new guests and topics for the show. So, I hope you enjoyed this upcoming discussion as much as I did, with Joe Jerome, Kendra Albert, and Elizabeth Ann Watkins.
Welcome to Tech Policy Grind. This is Joe alongside Emory, and this week we are joined by two awesome folks who are doing some fascinating work at the intersection of society and technology. Kendra Albert teaches at the Cyberlaw Clinic at Harvard Law School and is a fellow here at the Internet Law and Policy Foundry. And Elizabeth Ann Watkins is pursuing her PhD in communications at Columbia, studying how employees in different fields speak with each other about cybersecurity, privacy, and encryption. And together they sort of came together to co-author a paper and a project entitled Gig Work and the Digital Security Divide. So thank you both very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So we tend to start off the show by asking folks what they grind for, what they're passionate about in technology policy. But because we have two people today, I was hoping that you could both sort of talk to us about your different and varied and really interesting educational backgrounds and how you both came together to work on this really interesting research.
Sure. So this is Kendra, and I can start. So my way into tech policy was actually relatively unusual. My undergraduate degree is like I concentrated in lighting design for theater and in history. And so then sort of really got into thinking about how the law handled scientific evidence, which actually turned out to translate really well into thinking about how the law handles technology, because they're both sort of slightly technical fields where an expert saying one thing within the sort of language of science or the language of technology can be interpreted totally differently by a lawyer. And so I sort of started working as an intern at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and then sort of worked my way to working as a research associate, and then ended up going to law school to do technology law practice. But I'll let Elizabeth tell the story of actually how we first met each other and sort of came to collaborate.
Thanks, Kendra. I tell the story a lot at cocktail parties, so I've got it pretty polished by now.
Excellent. Best kind of podcast stories.
Once upon a time, I was really keen to be an assistant in research to Jonathan Zittrain up at the Berkman Klein Center.
Very cool.
Mm-hmm.
And I gave myself like an extra hour and a half to find the building because it was in the law school on the other side of Cambridge. And I finally arrived, and I was quivering. I was so nervous. I'd watched so many of this guy's lectures, and I was just so enamored with everything he and the Berkman were doing. And in this fit of coiterie, I was pulled into the office, and I met one of the friendliest and kindest people I've ever met. That's where Kendra was. And they said, "Hey, so Jonathan's not quite here yet, so how about we get to know each other?" And we had a really cool conversation that went into a lot of tangents that I absolutely did not expect to get into. And then Jonathan...
Theater lighting, what were the tangents?
Yeah, there was theater lighting. I had done a lot of experimental video artwork in my undergrad studying art at UC Irvine, and I finished a master's in art, culture, and technology at MIT. And so we started talking a lot about art and electronic art and digital art and installation art. So it turns out I did not get the job. But Kendra reached out and said, "Hey, so you didn't get the job, but would you like a friend instead?"
That's the best call. Yeah. Second
nice
best
consolation
call,
prize.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like to think that that sort of worked out for the best. I think after that we went and ate some fried pickles at Texas Roadhouse, and then our friendship and eventual research collaboration was forever secured, right?
Right,
But
pickles.
yeah, I think both Elizabeth and I sort of bonded over being folks with like arts backgrounds who were really interested in like art and sort of humanities and like culture, who sort of found ourselves doing more kind of like tech policy related or sort of like Elizabeth was doing more business school sort of stuff, but like sort of out maybe a little bit either out of our depth or with other not necessarily having tons of other folks who like shared that particular background. So although the interview did not result in a job offer, it did result in the friendship of I think now we're at like 5 years or so. So doing pretty okay.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
I think this is probably the most academic focused episode of Tech Policy Grind yet. If it's not, then it's certainly, I think our guests are the most prestigious schools so far, at least.
Kendra, dual Ivy Leaguers.
Dual Ivy Leaguers. I'm trying to figure out a way to work an Ivy League pun into the episode title. I'll keep you updated on that. But Kendra, you attended Harvard Law. Elizabeth, before Columbia, you actually were at MIT for the School of Architecture, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
So just because we have two Ivy Leaguers on the show today, I've got to ask, do you have any insights into the Ivy League educational experience? And then I guess the follow-up question, what appeals to you about the academic life, and did you find it at the Ivy Leagues?
Oh, it's an interesting, hard question. I will say, so I like to deploy my drama degree strategically when I want to make people feel more comfortable, right? They're like, I'm like, oh yes, I work on encryption stuff, but don't worry, my undergraduate degree is in drama, which is like, maybe actually not awesome, but that's a thing I do. But I will say one sort of funny thing about my experience particularly has been that like I went to a conservatory theater undergrad program, so it was like all theater all the time. And actually the first year bared a remarkable resemblance to Harvard Law School, at least for me. It was classes with all the same people. There were like often ridiculous expectations that were rooted in some sort of historical norm. You did a little bit of everything. You didn't really get to specialize. And so I think, what was sort of funny about it is I like sort of came out of my 1L year at Harvard being like the best preparation for law school is clearly a conservatory drama program. Like this is just the way to go, right? However, I think that for a lot of reasons that may not be most people's paths in. So I will just say that I do think like often school names and institutions sort of gain their own mystique. But I think like if you've really worked hard at any institution, like on something you're passionate about and maybe not always very good at, then those skills transfer well independent of the institution you end up at.
So I have two follow-up questions. First, for Kendra, you sort of addressed this earlier, but was there a particular moment or catalyst that made you shift from a pretty creative background into a life of the law? And then I guess, Elizabeth, where are you in getting your PhD? In my mind, I always think PhDs take 8 years or forever. So how is that going on for you?
8 years feels like forever. I'm in my third year now, and I think a lot of what Kendra is saying about kind of the transportability of an arts background has really rung true for me. In my art education in my undergrad, I had a professor who pulled me aside and said, "Elizabeth, I need to talk to you about something. I can tell that you really don't care about art."
Oh.
Wow. Okay. A bit taken aback, and he said, "Wait, let me finish. It's not that you don't care about art, but you care more about what art can do, and the way art thinking can help you to see the in-between and interstitial spaces between topics that don't seem to be connected on the surface." And so I've carried that with me forward into thinking about cybersecurity. And the way that I kind of first came in contact with cybersecurity was I was at the MIT School of Architecture, and I was really interested in YouTube and the way that YouTube provided like a platform of expression for a lot of different kinds of people to provide their own kind of outlook and recordings of events that had happened to them. Like all these different kinds of histories could come together on one platform. And after grad school, I had no idea what to do. I said, wait, what do you mean I have to get a job now?
The jobs are the worst.
Right.
Jobs.
The worst. And so, much
The
to my surprise,
only thing worse than a job is not having a job.
it turns out, that became apparent pretty fast. I said, wow, not having a job is somehow worse than getting a job. And much to my surprise, I ended up talking to someone who said, oh, you wrote your thesis at MIT about like how people talk to each other in digital spaces. And I said, yeah. And they said, well, that sounds a lot like marketing. You should come to Harvard Business School and write cases about marketing. And I said, that sounds just ridiculous enough to be, you know. So I ended up doing this is wacky. So I ended up doing that for a couple years. But then I thought, okay, clearly I don't want to spend the rest of my life talking about commercials and how to get people to buy more stuff. But there's something about the way that people are communicating through these interfaces that I want to keep pursuing. And so I ended up going into a PhD because that was the only place that could give me enough time to waste thinking about things that I had no conclusions or ideas about yet. And I ended up interviewing for a job on a cybersecurity research team looking at how journalists practice information security. And I got to the interview and I said, listen, in preparation for this interview last night, I tried to install PGP on my laptop. And
Not easy.
I failed miserably about 5 times in a row. So you shouldn't hire me. I shouldn't have this job.
I think that's a perfect indication of how the communication between users on cybersecurity issues is important to study, right? PGP shows the case.
You must have spoken to my boss because that's exactly what she said.
Do you have a preferred VPN?
I do not. I do not have a preferred. People ask me like, how do I encrypt? What is? And I said, I'm not really a solutions person. I'm more of a.
All right, so on
I
that
think
issue,
that,
wait, I've got to ask a follow-up question on that because I think that might segue into the answer to this question. What do you find most frustrating about academia that you wish that you knew earlier?
Well, I mean, I'm a proud navel gazer. I'm a carrying member of the navel gazing club. So I mean, I'm a big fan of academia. I really have fallen in love with the room and space that people are allowed to give to their work. I think one thing that has really surprised me kind of comes back around to my interest in these interstitial spaces is just how siloed academia is. I really thought coming into it that wow, I'm interested in like how people communicate like about technology ideas. Is there a way that I could combine studies of like human computer interaction with communication, with the way that like people do like collaborative and creative work in their workplaces? And everyone said that doesn't exist. You have to choose one of those.
So I think I now understand how you get to being interested in different facets of the gig economy. Let's bounce back to Kendra. I'd like to sort of understand your path through all of this and whether this is and also as an aside, what you're teaching as part of a Cyberlaw Clinic at Harvard, because that sort of sounds like something I would have loved to have done in law school.
Sure. So I think what I'm teaching is actually in many ways very, very different than my research interests. So I actually teach law students how to practice technology law, and that means everything from how to write emails to the client to how to do an intake to how to reorient your meeting when someone goes down a rabbit hole they shouldn't have.
Do you offer CLEs?
Not yet, but like, hey, if anyone wants to pay me to write to do a CLE on writing email, I am like, that is what I do most of my days. So it's actually a little bit of a strange situation. I mean, part of the job as a supervising attorney, is actually to sometimes give the most interesting parts of your project to your students. Like I had someone tell me that if you feel like all of the work you're doing is like the highest stakes, most important part of the case of your client matter, then you're actually kind of doing it wrong, because like the goal is to give the students those experiences. And actually that works really well for me because I like working on a lot of this stuff. And I like doing the research, and often I have sort of background knowledge, or like I'm like, you probably want to start somewhere like here. But I also just really enjoy listening to students discover the stuff for the first time and get to understand like tech policy or tech law. The first time a student walks in and has read an opposition comment in a regulatory proceeding, and it's just like, I really dislike the other side. Like, that was just like not cool. There's something, maybe it's a little bit Grinch-like, but my heart swells a couple of sizes, right? To be like, you can get really invested in these really technical, really nitty-gritty issues. And sort of, it's actually really funny because the sort of genesis for some of this gig work stuff is very different. It has to do more with sort of, I guess, like, for the lack of a better term, my side hustle than actually my job. Which is to say, I think like the moment I can like sort of trace back at least some of this work to actually has to do with pretty much very specifically with some of the stuff Elizabeth does, in that I once co-wrote an individual like article for Wired, and they decided they were going to pay me, which is very kind of them, and so they asked for me to send them a W-9, and out of like, knowing my digital security fundamentals, I was like, well, I don't really want to send my SSN over unencrypted email. Do you have some other way I can get this to you? And the editor was kind of like,
This is Wired magazine, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I think they've since gotten better, so I don't want to cast this person as Wired, right? But I ended up calling the editor and reading my SSN into her voicemail because I was just like, I don't know how to do this better.
Is that better?
I don't know. I like my theory was at least that'll get deleted and it's not sitting in like someone's inbox labeled W-9. But like, again, right? Like, so, and what I felt in that moment was this sort of sense of kind of powerlessness that like, if I wanted this paycheck and I didn't want to piss off this editor, right? Like, being like, I'm holding out for Signal is a good way to not get paid, right? And so I actually think that that was really a moment where I sort of was confronting the economic reality of making security choices, which is something that's really really at the center of some of this work around the gig economy. It's just this question of, when it's your livelihood on the line, what kinds of choices can you make, right? And that's a lot. So, Elizabeth and I started talking about some work I was doing on digital security for lawyers. And I think I was just like, yeah, lawyers are interesting, but like, I really want to talk about this experience about the economy and about gig workers. And Elizabeth was like, okay, cool. I think I might be misremembering. So Elizabeth, if that doesn't sound like your memory of what happened, feel free to jump in. But it was that kind of moment of being like, I'm right now I'm choosing between getting paid and like having a security practice that I'm actually comfortable with how I'm handling my data. And that was sort of, I think, the moment in which I was like, there's really a rich vein to be discussed here of how those two problems interact.
So I think that's a perfect transition point to get to the meat of this podcast, which is your work. I think, as you sort of made clear, larger and growing percentages of Americans are doing some type of gig work. I think the statistic that gets thrown around a lot is that most of the employment growth in the economy over the last decade has occurred in this space. So I tend to be Mr. Doom and Gloom generally, but I'd like to be optimistic. But I guess this is your opportunity, both of you, to explain the problem and get me scared about what's going on with security in the gig economy.
So, a lot of how we think about digital security and how digital security information is like propagated has to do with sort of like standardized workplaces. Like, I think often we sort of think of individuals as kind of atomistic, right? Like they're sort of, it's like, I'm just a human being making choices. But lots of those decisions are like that one I was making with that editor, right? They're influenced by all kinds of economic factors. And so what's interesting about the gig economy is that gig economy companies or gig economy platforms have some characteristics that are sort of a little different than how other parts of the economy work, right? And one of them is that the actual workers are sort of actually looped into this kind of like broader group. They're part of this broader group that we might call users. So rather than some sort of like some sort of, rather than HR, if you're an Uber driver, it's actually customer service that's kind of at the other end if you pick up the phone and try to call Uber.
Wow.
And the relationships between these workers and gig economy companies are pretty different.
I saw that in a slide that you prepared for this, or on a talk that you gave on this. There's some concentric circles describing the models of workers and employees and customers. And I thought it was actually really interesting the way that you described that really in the gig economy, the line between workers and customers isn't as clear. And essentially they're all just, quote unquote, users that are essentially negotiating on the same level against their employer. Is that essentially what you're talking about here?
Yeah, exactly. So, and and that's kind of a product of the economy, like economies of scale. But it also makes the sort of gig platforms a little different than how we might think of like traditional outsourcing, where even if you're outsourcing like particular parts of your company to other countries or other states or particular other smaller companies, you're not necessarily considering, like, those are still people who are working for you in some way, and your interactions with them are mediated. And I'll let Elizabeth talk a little bit about what the sort of existing research in this space and what her research on the Panama Papers sort of taught us about how that relationship is going to change digital security.
You did research on the Panama Papers?
Yeah, this is excellent. I'm pulling out the popcorn right now.
Yeah, thank you. I was really lucky in that my program is housed at the Columbia Journalism School. And so we actually have a few professors in the school who are members of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists that were the ones who broke the Panama Papers. And so we had really great access to the group, and that we were able to get in and interview and survey a majority of the reporters that were involved in the project and all of the technologists.
Wow.
Well, and I also wonder if we should address, in case people have forgotten exactly what the Panama Papers were.
Oh, yeah. So the Panama Papers were a leak that of 2.5 terabytes of information about politicians and people in governments all over the world that have led to the publication of a lot of stories about various governments, about corruption and scandals and money laundering and money movements that have actually led not only to the resignations of several heads of state, but journalists have been killed as a result of their participation with this project. And so something that we were really engaged by was how successful they were in protecting their information. They were dedicated completely to the protection of all of this data. And when you think about how big this leak was, I mean, the Snowden leak was only 60 gigs of information, and the Panama Papers is 2.5 terabytes. And so they had a lot of data, and they had 400 journalists working in, I think, 60 different organizations all over the planet. And so we thought, this is a huge coordination project that they did. This is a huge project management undertaking. What led to their success? So they had no breaches, no hacks, and no leaks of their own. How is it that they were able to do this? And something that has really been informed by my research with journalists in how they handle information security is kind of a big readjustment in how I think about security and the role of the user in security. Because I mean, I don't have a technical background. I'm an academic. I was trained as an artist, and so I always felt that when I failed, like in that first interview, when I came in and said, "Listen, I tried to install PGP and I failed," there was very much a thought of I failed. I couldn't do this. I wasn't smart enough to do it. I don't know why I couldn't. I guess I'm just bad at this kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. I mean, it's a sad perspective, but I think it's accurate.
And it turns out that it's really pervasive. We did a survey with users to ask them about their feelings about their experiences in trying to secure their own information and their own lives online. And people give us really emotional accounts. They say that they feel vulnerable, they feel helpless, they feel powerless. And in looking at in talking to journalists and seeing just how many of them just weren't able to put secure solutions into their workflows in like pre-Panama Papers work. We talk a lot to journalists at several other institutions, and they all told us, look, I have a job to do. I have to talk to my sources. My sources have to give me information. my job is clicking on insecure links. I can't always go through these solutions that security analysts tell me I'm supposed to do. And that's when I realized, okay, failure is so systemic to these infrastructures that it's not the user's fault. We need better solutions built into our systems and our structures. And so I carried that perspective into looking at how these journalists with the Panama Papers were so successful in preventing leaks, and the cultural and the social and psychological work that they put in to protecting each other and to reinforcing with each other that they were performing a social good and a cultural good when they all decided to invest in learning two-factor authentication, where they all decided together that they were all going to encrypt everything all the time. These were, first of all, technical solutions, yes, but they were coupled with social awareness, and awareness that these are solutions that have to take place within our lives, between our colleagues and with our friends.
So what's the status quo within the gig economy? And when we talk about gig economy, which platforms in particular are you concerned about, or did you look at?
So it's actually that Elizabeth left me a perfect opening to talk about this, because like her work on the Panama Papers shows how important these like social and cultural elements are, and how important this sort of idea of like trust is. And really, the gig economy is in some ways the inverse of that. Certainly, like there is worker organizing in the gig economy. You know, workers come together to share tips or, share information. But, generally speaking, gig economy platforms don't provide opportunities for workers to organize or gain those social connections that often are so key in other kinds of organizations. And so the particular platforms we looked at in the sort of course of this research were Uber, Lyft, and Instacart primarily, as well as spending some time on Grubhub and Handy, with an eye towards picking organizations that had slightly different models, that were of different sizes, and that that talk about and think about their workers in slightly different ways. And one of the things that we found that's really striking is that, in a way that was like, with the Wired editor, right? And I'm sorry to just keep returning to this anecdote, but I think it illustrates, right? I felt like I could call the Wired editor and, take my dubiously secure step of leaving my social security number in a voicemail, which I hope has been deleted, because if it hasn't, now I'm talking about this in public. But, I had a sort of workaround, right? And the whole point of many of these gig economy sort of onboarding processes, if you're a worker, is there is no workaround. You don't have an option that's, I don't want to upload my driver's license image to your service. And then, first of all, that information often becomes can be targeted or released through breaches, right? Uber's big
Uber's had some problems.
Yes. So Uber had the leak that, they may have paid someone off to prevent, but that data, that the breach that was about, included 600,000 driver's license numbers for workers. And what's really striking about that is driver's license numbers, you probably haven't had to enter them in online a lot, because they're actually usually like considered a pretty high security mechanism, right? Like they're the kind of thing that you're using for for a credit card application rather than for something else. So when you're uploading a picture of your driver's license to these platforms and you don't have a way around it, like I did, you are you as a worker may be setting yourself up for a sort of set of higher risks than workers in other economic situations.
So
that's sort of
Uber... Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. But...
No, go ahead.
So I think the Uber example is a really great example to point to, but is there also any sort of hard data or numbers on the effects that we're seeing from this disparity in security knowledge across the gig economy?
It's a great question. We don't have sort of like hard empirical numbers on gig workers specifically, partially because just people are really still studying these platforms, and there's some fantastic work by folks like Alex Rosenblatt and Luke Stark and Mary Gray, who have been sort of doing qualitative work, talking to workers, getting parts of their experience. But I think Elizabeth can talk a little bit more specifically about the kind of what we do know about different socioeconomic status and how that relates to security behavior.
Yeah, thanks, Kendra. There's a lot of really great studies showing how folks talk about security at home. And one of the most kind of revelatory studies or set of studies I found was that there are people who get training in security, and the people who do get that training by and large are 9 to 5 traditional white collar workers, which makes sense. Of course, like a 9 to 5 job, like you're going to go in, you're going to get the, hey, don't click on weird links workshop. You might even get some like fake phishing emails that are followed up by a prompt from your, IT team saying, hey, we saw that you clicked on this. This means you need to come in for extra training. But the aspect of that really drove home for me the importance of this is that there are other studies showing that people who get that training at work go home and they tell their friends and family what they need to know about how to protect themselves online.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah, right. So this information travels through networks of friends and family in the domestic space. And so that means that friends and family of white collar workers are more likely to protect themselves better online.
Wow. Okay.
So you can see that for folks who don't have access to these white collar environments, not only are they being cut off from sources of training, but so are all of their networks at home.
Sure. And as the gig economy grows and grows, or at least our economy shifts, you can see how that becomes a bigger problem. Do either of you have, I guess, solutions, or do you have things on, do you have
or
thoughts
even
on
just
what
a reason to be optimistic?
Yeah. Well, I guess, what should Uber be doing? What can Uber even do here?
So I actually think it's perfect that you picked Uber there because they've actually, despite some pretty high profile security problems, they've actually started running occasional trainings for Uber drivers to try to teach them security. And they've hired a security comms person whose job it is to start doing some of that work. And so I think, when I think about reasons to be optimistic, I think my framing is often that, as folks who work in security, and this was sort of the message of the talk we gave back in January, as folks who work in security, we need to be taking seriously the idea that our actions have consequences for people who like we wouldn't necessarily think of as the constituency we're trying to protect. So, a lot of these kinds of security models externalize this risk to the workers, right? They say, well, you're ultimately responsible for securing your own device. And I do think that's true, right? There is a responsibility, but just as Elizabeth said earlier, blaming the user is not necessarily a way towards promoting change. So rather than focusing on sort of how do I shift the risk elsewhere, one of the questions, and then I think companies are starting to ask now, is how do we take seriously our responsibility as people providing services that may force our workers to be more online, to share more information? How do we take seriously our responsibility to also help them be secure?
I think that's a great point to close on. I want to thank you guys both for joining us. Before we let you go, though, we want to sort of wrap up the show. So I guess can our listeners follow you on Twitter? Is there anything else that you'd like to plug here? Kendra, I know that you also you were talking about your side hustle a little earlier there. You offer workshops. Would you like to talk a little bit more about that? Let folks know where they can reach you to find out more. And also, I know that from 2016 to early 2017, you ran the project, the Trans Documentation Funding Project. Do you want to maybe plug that and talk a little bit about that project?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter at Kendra Serra, KendraSerra, which is actually a call out to a specific artist, which just goes to show that you never let go of the art, even if you go do other things with your lives.
Amen. That's good to hear.
Glad to hear.
And people can also check out my website, which is kendraalbert.com. And yeah, I run ally skills workshops, which are workshops for people who are interested in learning how to sort of stand up as an ally and like combat racism and sexism, transphobia, homophobia in their everyday lives. So if that's something that interests you, absolutely check out my website.
And the Trans Documentation Funding Project?
So I ran a project from 2016 to 2017 where I matched $100,000. Not personally, I do not have that kind of money, but I found $100,000 of kind people donated $100,000, which went towards funding documentation, like name and gender marker changes for trans folks. And to me, that project represents the things I love most and the things that make me optimistic about the internet, which is like people caring about and helping other people. And it was just an overwhelming, amount of support for people just being like, yeah, I have $100 I can pay for, or I have $120 I can pay for a passport for someone. And, that's, I think, what keeps me in this space is that belief that like people do want to do the right thing, and it's up to us to give them tools to do that.
Elizabeth, where can employees agitated about their cybersecurity practices reach you?
Yes, please come to me. As my advisors are beginning to lean on me about, I need interviews. I need to talk to people. My Twitter is Watkins_welcome. It's a pun on Watkins welcome.
I never knew that, and I've been like tweeting your Twitter account for a long time. Learn something new every podcast.
That's really the goal. We can shut it down now, guys.
Anyway, I can spread puns around the world. I've succeeded. It's been a good day. So yeah, WATKINS_welcome. If you are an employee, if you're a gig worker, if you are an employee of a gig work company, all of my research is anonymous. You will not be identified. I've been certified in human subjects research training. So please come to me. That would be amazing. And I would be so grateful to help folks figure out solutions and use the experiences of everyday people to build better systems and structures for all.
Good to hear, and happy to hear that you're doing so in an ethical fashion. Well, thank you both very much for joining us today. And listeners, thanks for following in and listening in with us. You can always hit us up at Tech Policy Grind on Twitter. And as always, please, pretty please, rate and review the show if you're listening to it. We need your feedback. And in fact, you know what? If any of you out there write a review or hit us up with some comments, critical or not, I think I might actually share that on the show in the future.
This has been an episode of Tech Policy Grind, a podcast from the Internet Law and Policy Foundry. We're a collection of early career professionals paving the way in the tech policy world, and we really hope you enjoyed the show. If you like what you just heard, it would be a huge help and mean a lot to us if you could head over to iTunes and leave a rating and a review. If you don't have iTunes, maybe just share the show with a friend. You can follow us on Twitter at Tech Policy Grind and keep your ears peeled for new episodes twice a month on alternating Mondays. We want to thank Ali Sternberg for producing the intro and outro music for the show, and thank you all for listening. So, until next time, thanks.